Happy Monday, eighth graders. We are continuing with our reading of the book Thief. We are on The Ageless Brother. Lisa Limminger was a few weeks short of 14. Her papa was still away. She'd completed three more reading sessions with a devastated woman. On many nights, she'd watch Rosa sit with the accordion and pray with her chin on top of the bellows. Now, she thought, it's time. Usually it was stealing that cheered her up, but on this day, it was giving something back. She reached under her bed and removed the plate. As quickly as she could, she cleaned it in the kitchen and made her way out. It felt nice to be walking up through mulching. The air was sharp and flat, like the watching of a sadistic teacher or nun. Her shoes were the only sound on Munich Street. As she turned, as she crossed the river, a rumor of sunshine stood behind the clouds. At 8 Grand Strasse, she walked up the steps, left the plate by the front door, and knocked. And by the time the door was opened, the girl was around the corner. Liesel did not look back. But she knew that if she did, she'd have found her brother at the bottom of the steps again, his knee completely healed. She could even hear his voice. That's better, Liesel. It was with great sadness that she realized that her brother would be sick forever. But when she held that thought, she also made an effort to smile. She remained at the Amper River, at the bridge, where Papa used to stand and lean. She smiled, and when it all came out, she walked home, and her brother never climbed into her sleep again. In many ways, she would miss him, but she could never miss his deadly eyes on the floor of the train or the sound of a cough that killed. The book thief lay in bed that night, and the boy only came before she closed her eyes. He was one member of a cast, for Liesel was always visited in that room. Her papa stood and called her half a woman. Max was writing the word shaker in the corner. Rudy was naked by the door. Occasionally, her mother stood on a bedside train platform. And far away, in the room that stretched like a bridge to a nameless town, her brother, Werner, played in the cemetery snow. From down the hall, like a metronome for the visions, Rosa snored, and Liesel lay awake, surrounded, but also remembering a quote from her most recent book. The Last Human Stranger, page 38. There were people everywhere on the city street, but the stranger could not have been more alone if it were empty. When morning came, the visions were gone, and she could hear the quiet recital of words in the living room. Rosa was sitting with the accordion, praying. Make them come back alive, she repeated. Please, Lord, please. All of them. Even the wrinkles around her eyes were joining hands. The accordion must have ached her, but she remained. Rosa would never tell Hans about these moments, but Lisa believed that it must have been those prayers that helped Papa survive the LSE's accident in Essen. If they didn't help, they certainly can't have hurt. Next chapter, The Accident. It was a surprisingly clear afternoon, and the men were climbing into the truck. Hans Huberman had just sat down in his appointed seat. Reinhold Zucker was standing above him. Move it, he said. Bitte? Excuse me? Zucker was hunched beneath the vehicle's ceiling. I said, move it, Arschloch. The greasy jungle of his fringe fell in clumps onto his forehead. I'm swapping seats with you. Hans was confused. The back seat was probably the most uncomfortable of the lot. It was the draftiest, the coldest. Why? Does it matter? Zucker was losing his patience. Maybe I want to get off first to use the shed house. Hans was quickly aware that the rest of the unit was already watching this pitiful struggle between two supposed grown men. He didn't want to lose, but he didn't want to be petty either. Also, they'd just finished a tiring shift, and he didn't have the energy to go on with it. Bent backed, he made his way forward to the vacant seat in the middle of the truck. Why did you give in to that Seichkopf? The man next to him asked. Hans lit a match and offered a share of the cigarette. The draft back there goes straight through my ears. The olive green truck was on its way toward camp, maybe 10 miles away. Brunenweg was telling a joke about a French waitress when the left front wheel was punctured and the driver lost control. The vehicle rolled many times, and the men swore as they tumbled with the air, the light, the trash, and the tobacco. Outside, the blue sky changed from ceiling to floor as they clamored for something to hold. When it stopped, they were all crowded onto the right hand wall of the truck, their faces wedged against the filthy uniform next to them. Questions of health were passed around until one of the men, Eddie Alma, started shouting, "Get this bastard off me!" He said it 3 times fast. He was staring into Reinhold Zucker's blinkless eyes. The damage, Essen. 6 men burned by cigarettes, 2 broken hands, several broken fingers, a broken leg for Hans Huberman, a broken neck for Reinhold Zucker, snapped almost in line with the earlobes. They dragged each other out until only the corpse was left in the truck. The driver, Helmut Broman, was sitting on the ground, scratching his head. "The tire," he explained, "it just blew." Some of the men sat with him and echoed that it wasn't his fault. Others walked around smoking, asking each other if they thought their injuries were bad enough to be relieved of duty. Another small group gathered at the back of the truck and viewed the body. Over by the tree, a thin strip of intense pain was still opening in Hans Huberman's leg. "It should have been me," he said. "What?" the sergeant called over from the truck. "He was sitting in my seat." Helmut Broman regained his senses and climbed back into the driver's compartment. Sideways, he tried to start the engine, but there was no kicking it over. Another truck was sent for, as was an ambulance. The ambulance didn't come. "You know what that means, don't you?" said Boris Schipper. They did. When they resumed the trip back to camp, each man tried not to look down at Reinhold Zucker's open mouthed sneer. "I told you we should have just turned him face down," someone mentioned. A few times, some of them simply forgot and rested their feet on the body. Once they arrived, they all tried to avoid the task of pulling him out. When the job was done, Hans Huberman took a few abbreviated steps before the pain fractured in his leg and brought him down. An hour later, when the doctor examined him, he was told it was definitely broken. The sergeant was on hand and stood with half a grin. "Well, Huberman, looks like you've got away with it, doesn't it?" He was shaking his round face, smoking, and he provided a list of what would happen next. "You'll rest up. They'll ask me what we should do with you. I'll tell them you did a great job." He blew some more smoke. "And I think I'll tell them you're not fit for the LSE anymore, and you should be sent back to Munich to work in an office or do whatever cleaning up needs doing there. How does that sound?" Unable to resist a laugh within the grimace of pain, Hans replied, "Sounds good, Sergeant." Boris Schipper finished his cigarette. "Damn right it sounds good. You're lucky I like you, Huberman. You're lucky you're a good man and generous with the cigarettes." In the next room, they were making up the plaster. Next chapter, The Bitter Taste of Questions. Just over a week after Liesel's birthday in mid February, she and Rosa finally received a detailed letter from Hans Huberman. She ran inside from the mailbox and showed it to Mama. Rosa made her read it aloud, and they could not contain their excitement when Liesel read about his broken leg. She was stunned to the extent that she mouthed the next sentence only to herself. "What is it?" Rosa pushed. "Samich." Liesel looked up from the letter and was close to shouting. The sergeant had been true to his word. "He's coming home, Mama. Papa's coming home." They embraced in the kitchen, and the letter was crushed between their bodies. A broken leg was certainly something to celebrate. When Liesel took the news next door, Barbara Steiner was ecstatic. She rubbed the girl's arms and called out to the rest of her family. In the kitchen, the household of Steiners seemed buoyed by the news that Hans Huberman was returning home. Rudy smiled and laughed, and Liesel could see that he was at least trying. However, she could also sense the bitter taste of questions in his mouth. Why him? Why Hans Huberman and not Alex Steiner? He had a point. And that's our story for today. We will see you again tomorrow.